Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Plague Inc. This game was designed by James Vaughn, and it is based on a very popular iOS game where you are trying to infect the world with your disease and try to kill off as many people as you can. This game is competitive, so you are each diseases trying to outkill, and you are also going to be modifying and mutating as the game goes on with a bit of engine building mixed in. First I'll explain how the game works, and then I'll jump into my review. Here we have Plague Inc. set up for 4 players. You'll notice that each player was randomly given a starting country and we each put one disease token down onto it. Around the outside is the DNA track, which counts as victory points. You win the game if you have the most of those, but also can be used as a currency. And since we are purple and we're the starting player, we actually start with 0 DNA, and then each player in clockwise order gets 1 more than the last. On each player mat, we have a turn summary so that we can see each step that we need to take on one of our turns. The first step is the DNA phase, where we score 1 DNA point for each country that we control, but we also have this bonus DNA trait that we have, as well as everybody on their starting player board. We'll see that it says during the DNA phase, we get 1 extra DNA point. In order to control a country, you have to have the most or tied for the most disease tokens in that given country compared to your opponents. So at the beginning of the game, we are only down here in South Africa. We are not in any of the other countries. This means we control 1 country because we have 1 and nobody else has any. When we add in that 1 bonus DNA, that means we get 2 DNA when we get to go up to 2. Next up, we have the country phase, where we are either going to place a new country out onto the board, or we will discard a country in order to dump our hand of trade cards and then draw new ones. There are always 4 countries available to choose from, and if you don't like any of these, you can go blind from the top of the deck. And when you actually choose a country, for instance, we might take Japan for this demonstration turn, we will then have to put it down into the continent that matches it. In this case, it goes down into Asia. So we put it down over here, and the actual relative location within the given continent doesn't really matter, so we can just put it right there. Next up, we have the evolution phase, where we can pay our DNA points to put 1 new trade card into play onto our disease. And we start with these 5 cards in our hand, and you can see from the number in the top left that it can vary widely how many points you actually spend on this. If we want total organ failure, it's going to cost 21 DNA, and right now we only have 2. So if we look over here, we see that air transmission only costs 2 DNA, and it gives us the ability of airborne. This is going to allow us to move from one country with the plane symbol to another country with the plane symbol. This lets us potentially hop over continents. But if you want to see some of the other options, this one can give you cold resistance. You cannot go into countries with a little snowflake symbol unless you have this. Likewise, with the diarrhea over here, gives you heat resistance for those hot countries. And then some things like paranoia just really increase your infectivity, which I'll talk about in a second. But for now, we can go ahead and put this air transmission down. And we have 5 different locations we can put this into, but there's no reason to cover up these 2 until you really have to, because they're nice to have in your back pocket. Since air transmission costs 2 DNA, we go down to 0. And now we can jump into the infection phase. Here we count up our overall infectivity on all of our traits. We see right now we start with 2 infectivity, then we look down here and we can put that many tokens out onto the map into countries that we are connected to and climate resistant to. And we have now increased our connectivity by having this airborne ability. This means that, for instance, we could put both these 2 tokens down into South Africa, or we could send one over to France because we've flown from this airport over to that one through being airborne, and then we could also put this one over here into Japan, and you are always connected to every country that is within the continent. So by jumping over here to Japan, that means instead of going to France, we instead could have gone to Japan and then jumped over into South Korea that only has this anchor symbol, and you can jump between anchor symbols just like airborne, in this case with a waterborne trait, and in this way you can really jump from continent to continent trying to spread out your disease. In this way, you can now see how something like paranoia will help you spread much faster by increasing your lethality by 2. If I had this down here, I would have put 4 tokens down instead of 2, which is a very big swing. So now we have the death phase. This is the final phase of each turn, and for each fully infected country that we control, we have to roll this death die. For the sake of demonstration, I have gone ahead and skipped ahead to fill up South Korea and Japan. So now you have to control the country. So that means that we control Japan right now because we have the same amount of tokens as the yellow player here. We do not control South Korea though, because we have 2 and green has 3. So even though it is full, we're not going to roll the death die. But this one is full and we control it. So we're going to roll this die. And now the value of this is going to be applied to our lethality level. And we see if this country has been killed off. We just rolled a 4 for Japan, and when we look at our disease, we see that we have a lethality of 1, and that means that Japan would be killed off if we had rolled a 1 or less. So that means that it's kind of hard to kill off countries in the early stages of the game, but if, for instance, we had this total organ failure, which we can't afford for quite a while with 21 DNA, then we would actually have had 4 lethality, and then that roll of 4 would have killed Japan off. The first thing that happens when a country is killed is that every player with tokens on that country gets 1 DNA for each token, so we would immediately get 3 DNA, and the yellow player would also get 3 DNA even though it's not currently their turn. Now all these tokens are going to go back to the respective players, and the person who actually killed the country off gets to keep this country card. And lastly, each player who had a token in that country gets to draw one of these event cards. So yellow would get this one, and we would get this one right here. It says Execute Infected. And you are never allowed to have more than 3 of these in your hand. So if we actually already had 3, we would not even have drawn from the top of the pile. And each one of these event cards has text on them, and they tell you what they do and when you can do it. For instance, this one says, at the end of your turn, if you have killed any countries, you can choose up to 4 countries and remove 1 token from each of those countries. So right now, if we wanted to, we could use this because we killed at least 1 country and remove probably our opponent's tokens from a variety of other countries out there on the board to evaluate this Execute Infected event. So with that, we've completed all the steps to a player's turn, and play would continue clockwise, and we were going to keep playing until this entire deck of country cards is exhausted. And not only that, but we're going to keep going until all the country cards are pulled off from this row as well. Once that happens, we go into a sudden death mode, wherein the game will be very close to ending. At this point, players must now check at the end of every turn to see if any one player has no tokens left on the board. If that's true, the game ends immediately, or at the end of any turn where a player was not able to put any new tokens down or roll the death die, then the game will end after that specific turn. Once that's done, players will go into final scoring. The first thing players do is add up all of the DNA points that are in the top left corner for all of their traits. In this case, the purple player has 40 points here, and if they ever actually put a trait on top of a previous trait, which you can do throughout the game, it erases that previous trait, you do not count up the DNA points on that specific one. So in this instance, they would get 40 points and add it to the DNA track. And then they will evaluate the 3 endgame bonuses. The first is 4 points to the player with the most tokens that are still out on the board when the game is over. The next is for each of the 6 continents, players will get 6 points if they have killed the most of the countries in that specific continent, and ties are friendly for these. And lastly, the player who killed the country with the most of these locations for tokens is going to get 7 points for the ultimate wipeout. Once you add up all of these points into the DNA track, whoever has the most points wins the game. There's one last brief thing I'd like to mention, and that is that I've been showing the game through the eyes of this bacteria side, but there's also a flip side on the player boards, which also has 2 infectivity and 1 lethality, but instead of getting that bonus DNA every turn until it's covered, the virus player gets a mutation and genetic switch as extra abilities. That means that they can more quickly switch throughout their different trait cards, but the detractor is they, of course, don't get the bonus DNA when they play as the virus. Let's now begin the review for Plague Inc. by starting with a couple positive points. And the first of these has to do with the act of spreading your disease tokens out onto the map. This is something that you're going to be doing hopefully every single turn of the game, and it is definitely an interesting decision oftentimes when you're trying to figure out what countries to actually bolster up where you already have some disease going on, and if you want to put more in there, and other countries that you want to maybe jump over. There are other decisions that you need to make, like do I want to cap out a country that I am controlling well so that if it potentially dies when we actually roll the death die, I'll actually get those benefits. Or maybe you even cap out a country that you are barely in so that you can try and force it to actually be destroyed by the death die before one of your opponents seems like they actually want it to go away. There's also the decision to be made about how you're going to be getting around the map. If you have the waterborne or the airborne trait, for instance, you are definitely going to be thinking about where you can actually jump over to get into new continents, because a big problem that can happen while you're playing the game is you can potentially get locked into one continent, and then a bunch of, like if you're in South America and then a bunch of awesome stuff comes out for Asia and you have a really hard time getting out actually over there with your tokens. You need to think about strategically jumping ship at the right moment so that you'll have a little bit of a foothold in a new continent from which you can actually spread out. And from a thematic perspective, I think that it's actually relatively strong when it comes to actually spreading the diseases out on the board, when you actually mix that with the mechanics of also just trying to get everywhere as well as get the majorities in the various countries that you're trying to infect. For positive number 2, I want to discuss the great sense of escalation that you get as you are doing your mutations and engine building as you're playing the game. everybody's going to start off with the same disease at the beginning of the game. I suppose it's possible you might flip over your player board and play from the perspective of a virus instead of a bacteria, but for the most part, you are all in a similar situation, and there is a great sense of escalation as you are starting to play, as you are starting to ramp in and mutate to become more effective out there on the board. You might get coughing going or seizures, and some of them can be a little bit more extreme, like diarrhea as well as psychosis. And the things that you are doing not only feel thematic, how they match up to the effects they have with, for instance, your effectiveness, just how much you can spread out on the map, as well as the lethality, how often you actually kill the people that you are infecting. And it's great to see as you actually build up on your board, everybody starts off with a couple abilities that you will probably eventually cover over. And at the end of the game, people are definitely going to be mutating back and forth and like trying to become more lethal at the right moment and then become less lethal. So it's a interesting dynamic engine that you are constructing as you're playing the game. And I just like how you are so much more powerful at the end of the game than you were at the beginning. And there is to a certain degree a reasonable amount of customization that you have done, especially from a thematic perspective on your specific disease. Although I will admit that your disease will probably not look that much different from one of your opponents. It just means maybe you're one more infective than they are, and they're maybe one or two more lethal than you are, but I'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on in the review. Let's now shift over into a few neutral points, and the first of these has to do with the event deck. Now, this is an optional inclusion, but I have played with it every single time, and I have a couple different feelings on this. On the one hand, I really love the thematic connection that it gives the game. You feel like these events really are happening as the world is getting ravaged by these diseases. It might be borders getting locked down. It could be the Olympics. It could be a nuclear strike. There's just all sorts of things that are going on in there, and I think the variety is great within that event deck. But another thing to keep in mind is that they can be pretty swingy. They can do pretty devastating effects, not always on the person who is actually winning the game. So I think that it's something that you should definitely include in every game, but it's also something that you should go into understanding that this can really change the overall layout of the board. And I think that is good because it's one key thing that also makes this game not feel like just an abstract game of just like putting tokens out there. It really pulls you into the theme more. Of course, the mutations are great for the theme as well, but this is really going to be the thing that mechanically shakes up the situation out there on the board most often. Those event cards actually lead me into neutral number 2, and that is that this is a potentially mean game. There is a lot of direct conflict that's going to be happening between players when it comes to those event cards. Many of them you could just say are just straight up take that. You just play them down, you remove stuff from players, you maybe wipe out a country that they were trying to do well in. There's just a variety of things that you can do to directly mess with your opponent's plans. But also you just have the act of putting your tokens down on the board, and that is more of an indirect interaction between the players, but that does not mean that it cannot feel mean at times. Like if you put a couple tokens into a spot to try and have it actually blow up before a player wants it to do so, or maybe you just, by putting that one token down, you are taking the majority and it has an odd number of spots on it so that you will definitely have the majority, of course, until an event potentially wipes that out from underneath you. But there are lots of times when you're playing this game that you're going to do an action, whether it be put a token down on the map or play an event card that's going to have one of your opponents groaning. And hopefully you set an expectation at the beginning of the game that this is a game with conflict. You're definitely going to be getting in each other's faces, so that won't be like an exasperated or painful groan, but they'll definitely, even if it's you're having a fun time, there'll be moments where you're just like, oh my gosh, there's like, it was perfect. I had this amazing plan and you just did that one thing. Why didn't you draw that one card? And that's going to happen. And I suppose to a certain extent, that makes sense in a game where you're conflicting diseases trying to eradicate the human population from the entire world. It makes sense that you'd be mean, but it's something that you should know going into the game. My third and last neutral point has to do with the death die. Now, when I first started hearing about this game, I actually backed it on Kickstarter. I was really in until I learned about the death die, and I was like, wait, what? At the end of your turn, you roll the die to see if the country is removed? It felt really antiquated, like from a mechanical perspective. And once I actually started playing the game, I realized that I actually like the death die. I think it works very well for the theme that you're trying to have, as well as how it influences your specific disease. Like, it's a thing. You can make yourself more lethal. And if you get to the point where your lethality is 4, then you have a very good chance of rolling the die and actually killing off countries, versus at the beginning of the game, everybody has a lethality of 1, and that does leave opportunities for surprising randomness to pop into the game. But I think from a thematic perspective, that is kind of okay. But there have definitely been times where I've I've seen somebody with a lethality of 4 miss like 3 death rolls in a row, and then the next person has killed 3 countries off with the lethality of 1. They just keep rolling ones. And that is potentially an issue for some players. I mean, it's again a thing you need to go in understanding, and I like that there's some variance with the lethality, that it's not just a one-to-one thing. It's like, I have lethality of 5, therefore I kill every country that has 5 tokens in it, or something like that. It's fun having that tense moment of rolling the die to see what happens, and it's certainly not always going to do what you want to do, but that one single act of a single die variance is a good thing for you to know going into the game. I think it does mechanically work, but it is certainly going to turn off some people. Let's now move into the negative points section, and I only have one to cover, and it has to do with that deck of mutation cards. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy the act of escalating as well as modifying on the fly the disease that I am occupying so that I can best react to the current world state. But the issue I have with that deck of mutation cards is it's very homogenous. The different thematic things that are on the tops are interesting, and it's kind of fun to like read out all the crazy stuff that your disease is doing. But at the end of the day, you like draw a hand of these and you're like, okay, well, a couple of infectivity, this one gives cold resistance, and this one has airborne, as well as 1 lethality, or something like that. And it just feels like there was so much room to be more interesting with these cards. Like the base set of cards that comes in this deck, I feel like if you cut that deck in half, and then just had that be half of your new base set, and then came up with 50% more interesting cards, maybe cards that had text written on them that would be like, when you go into Europe, this special thing happens, or just various outlier abilities would, I think, make customizing your disease much more interesting. While the names are fun, it does seem at the end of the game that everybody's disease has escalated up, and like maybe one person is slightly better at lethality and another person is slightly better at infectivity, but from a mechanical perspective, it feels a bit samey, especially from game to game. The first 1 or 2 games, I didn't have much of a problem with this, but once I got into those 3rd and 4th games, I found myself really desperately wishing that I could draw up some of those mutation cards and just have something fun and cool and knock your socks off on that card. And of course, you have the event deck, which is going to do lots of crazy zany things, but those are one-shot things. I would love to see some more thematically interesting as well as mechanically interesting cards and effects added into that mutation deck, and perhaps this is something that they'll add in the future with an expansion, although I haven't heard anything necessarily about that. Let's now discuss the variability for Plague Inc., and I think that it is slightly below average. In every single respect, except for that mutation deck, I think that it is spot on an average style amount of variability I would expect from this type of game. You have that event deck with a bunch of different types of cards in it, which will keep things varied, but then also you have the deck of countries that you're going to be putting out onto the board, and honestly, if I was just to talk about those two things, I would say that it might be even slightly above average when it comes to how one game is going to play to the next, because you don't play with all the countries. So in one game, maybe you almost never go to North America, and in another game, there's tons of North America and very little down in Eurasia, and that various thing. But as I mentioned in the only negative point, I feel like there was a pretty big missed opportunity for interesting mutations to be added into that deck, and since that is such a key fundamental aspect to this game, and events happen somewhat often near the late game, but mutations happen right from the very beginning, I feel like that brings down the variability to a slightly below average perspective. I do think that the game does start to suffer a bit for not having more interesting stuff in that mutation deck. Plague Inc. plays 2 to 5 players, and I've only played the 3 and 5 player experiences, but I will say that I think 3 is best. That 5-player game was way too long, and downtime was atrocious. There are quite a few things, steps to every single person's turn, and in that 5-player game, it just felt like an eternity before I got to take another turn, so I would definitely not recommend that. And I'm honestly not sure if that's in every box of this, or if that was a Kickstarter exclusive add-on, but either way, I think 3 is going to be the main way you're going to want to play this game. 4 is probably okay, but downtime is certainly going to become a factor. If it was so bad at 5, it's going to be there at 4. And at 3, you have situations where you can have 2 people gang up on a potential leader, which you're not going to be able to do in a 2-player experience where it's just you and that one other person. Perhaps somebody could run away a little bit, although I don't have any experience with it, so I can't actually say. But all those things are the reason why I think it's likely best at 3. In conclusion, I've played Plague Inc. 4 times at this point, and I've enjoyed all 4 of those plays. If I'm being honest, this game surprised me to a certain extent. I was not expecting to like it as much as I have, but that being said, I don't think it necessarily has a staying power to stick around all that much longer in my collection. And there's a couple things going on here. The first is the variability from the mutation deck. I just feel like once I got into that 3rd and 4th play of the game, I was just kind of doing the same things I was doing in the first couple plays. Like the excitement had worn off off to a certain extent because I just wanted more variety, and I felt like I was just going through the same motions with slightly different countries out there on the map. All that being said, though, I think from a thematic perspective, this game has a lot of very strong points going for it. Like, it does kind of do a good job of simulating this competitive global apocalypse as you're trying to out-eradicate all the humans out there. Not only with the actual text on those mutation cards, there might not be as much variety on them from a mechanical perspective as I'd like, but it is interesting to be near the mid-late game and be like, I mean, I'm coughing and psychosis, and people can't sleep, and there's all these kind of crazy things that my diseases are doing to people, and then you bring in that event deck, which really pulls you into just the feeling of events, with like nuclear strikes and the Olympics and all those kind of things that I mentioned before. You also have like bird migrations and various things that will do various strong mechanical effects to the area majority game that's happening out there on the board, but also from a thematic perspective, feel very connected to the overall experience. And then you also have the death die, where the level of lethality of the most powerful disease in a specific country is going to dictate whether or not that country just gets wiped off if it's completely eradicated. And I think that gets pulled into a great sense of tension as well. Now, I will say that several of the people that I played this with did not love the take-that-ness of the game. Like, it's definitely a strong interaction style game where you can just play a card that, or somebody can play a card on you that you were not expecting that completely derails your plans. And that can be frustrating. You need to go into this a bit lighthearted and, say, well, I'll get you next time with this card that I have in my hand. So there's a lot of tit for tat going on. And if you enjoy that in games, then I think you will definitely like that here. But for people who are more into indirect conflict style games, this might be laying it on a little bit too thick. So when I add all of these things together, I think I recommend this game, but at the same time, it's probably going to be leaving my collection relatively soon. I just don't feel any inclination to actually get it played anymore, and I don't know if there's going to be expansion in the future. If they do come out with one that brings in much more interesting things into that mutation deck, I would be interested in playing it again, but I don't think it's worth me just holding on to it on the hopeful event of that happening out there in the future. So this is a cool game. It just didn't quite have the staying power for me, but I think this is definitely one you should give a shot to if it sounds even remotely interesting to you. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting my channel through Patreon, including all of these producer level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.